Our customers will tell you that more times than not, the way they found their business is that an opportunity presented itself. They were open to that opportunity when it fell into their lap or came across their desk.
Welcome to Sound Financial Bites, where we help you with bite-sized pieces of financial and life knowledge to help you design and build a good life. The knowledge that has been shared from stages at conferences, pages of national business magazines, and clients living across America, our host, Paul Adams, now brings directly to you.
Hello and welcome to Sound Financial Bites. It's so good to have you here today. I'm Paul Adams, and I am so glad that you're going to get a chance to listen to David Nilssen. David Nilssen is co-founder and CEO of Guidant Financial. In a few moments, I'm going to have him share with you what they do uniquely to help small business owners. And something unique that even if you're that high income earning executive right now, what we're going to cover in the episode today is really going to peel back the onion of the kinds of things that you can do financially that you otherwise might not know about if you weren't a listener to this podcast. You know, back in episodes 64, 65, and 66, we took time to talk about everybody who has an interest in you participating in your 401k. One of those being your actual employer that would love for you to just continue to work for them at least to age 59 and a half. That many years ago, they stopped giving us pensions, instead did a 401k, but they still trap, without us even knowing, they gladly assist us in throwing our money into a program that cuts off much of the ability to be an entrepreneur. And David and his company, Guidant, have begun to crack the code around that. Now, before I introduce David, a couple of key points. One, as you all have heard me talk about the 4 different subjects that we cover in these podcasts, we're going to cover at least 3 of those. So I'm not going to designate this as a specific type of podcast. This one's going to have business and career thinking. This one's going to have probably a touch of analytical thinking. And it's going to have a bit of financial philosophy all kind of built into this one episode. Now, to give you the background introduction of David and who he is, he's co-founder and CEO of Guidant. Now, Guidant, if you Google them, Guidant Financial, they've helped 14,000 entrepreneurs source over $4 billion of capital. David is heavily involved in the angel investing community here in the Seattle area. He's been in leadership positions with organizations like the Entrepreneurs Organization here in Seattle and globally, which is how David and I originally got to know one another. He's the author of the book, Making the Jump into Small Business Ownership. He's written for Fortune and a regular contributor to HuffPost and Entrepreneur. And what I think is one of the most fun, and if you look at the background on his computer, I think his most fun fact is he's a new dad to Lucy. And before I finally let David talk, let me share with all of you the great gift he has given to our audience. David is giving away his book, Making the Jump into Small Business Ownership, to anyone in our audience. You can find the link at the show notes or simply go to jump.sfgwa.com. That's jump.sfgwa.com. Put in your email address, and his book will be in your email box before the day is out. So, welcome. I'm so glad you could be with us today, David.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here as well.
So let's just start off with this idea that when you work with business owners here at Guidant, how do you serve them?
Yeah, so Guidant was originally established to help small business owners find the capital that they need to buy or build businesses. So the work that we initially were doing was specifically that, making sure that they had a long enough runway to get to profitability, because we know small businesses, especially where the total capital requirement is under $1 million. The runway is often longer than they expected. So we've spent a lot of time designing our business around making sure that that runway is as long as possible and that we are increasing the success rates of our customers long term. Now, what we found, though, as we were building the business is that not only is the small business community underserved in terms of the way that the capital is provided, but it also doesn't have the same access to great providers for services that they need in order to operate their business long term. So we work as a pseudo virtual partner in helping them source great payroll companies and bookkeeping firms and tax providers, even places where they can buy their URL for their new website, equipment for their computers, so on and so forth. So we want to make it easy for people to establish their businesses and partner with them so that they have the optimum opportunity for success long term.
Which seems to do something unique. So as you're helping them source capital, we're going to talk about a couple of different ways that you do that. But as you help them source capital, what you're also doing is being strategic in supporting them and being successful in it. Because one of the things I think about are, let's say somebody was an executive for some large Fortune 500 companies, take like a Univar, an Amazon, and they say, okay, I'm done with this. I've got some money on my balance sheet. My kids are out of the house, or maybe the kids aren't out of the house, but I'm, for whatever reason, done with being in a corporation. And I want to go do something else. I want to start my own business. They may have been in one silo of a very large company. So it's very difficult. I can see, and I've seen our clients experience it, where they go out and they're like, okay, so what do I do for an email provider? And what do I do for a CRM? And what do I do for payroll? Because they've been in one silo with some expertise. As Michael Gerber talks about, they have an entrepreneurial fit. And they're like, I can do it better in some way. They go out to do it, and then they find that there's all these gaps in knowledge. So along with making sure that they get capital, you make sure they fill the capital gap and the knowledge gap to be able to do what they want to do.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you even referenced Michael Gerber, right? And he, in his book, he talks about the fact that a lot of people that are starting businesses are actually subject matter experts who want to become a business owner. So in his example, it was the baker who wanted to own a bakery so she could bake all day long. And it turns out when you're actually the owner, you don't get to bake all day long. There's a lot more to it. And then from our perspective, there's financing for small businesses is a highly fragmented marketplace. And you've seen in the last 3 or 4 years, this emergence of the online lender. Well, those guys generally are not taking any balance sheet risk. They are brokering loans. And so once they've given you the capital, they wash their hands of the deal and they're off and running. We play sort of a hybrid between, say, like a Wells Fargo, a traditional financial institution, and one of those lenders, in that we are brokering capital for other people. We're not necessarily taking the balance sheet risk, but we make sure that we're aligned with the customer's success long term.
Oh, that's great. Can you give us some, and right before we do this, I think it's important. We're going to cover a lot in our conversation today. What's important for all of our listeners to understand is that if you go out and launch a new business and you borrow money, or you use some of the unique financing you can do with your own retirement plan, what you need to do is make sure you fully understand the risks, the costs, the tax impacts of doing that. If we, like for instance, in doing this podcast, I had to talk to an attorney to make sure that I understood the impact of talking about this. And one of the ways we handle that is doing this. But you need to understand your risks in doing something like this. Now, I think I've satisfied the attorneys, both for Guidant and for Sound Financial Bites. So with that, share us with a little bit about maybe a few of the companies that if people go to your website, they're going to know the names of some of these companies.
Sure.
Would you share kind of what they did, how they got started, how long ago, like a few of those, so that people get a sense of like we're in a beautiful building right now, downtown Bellevue, and Bellevue, Washington, for our listeners across the country. You've got just an amazing amount of people out here that are working to help business owners the way you serve them. But give us an example of a few of them that have done what you're talking about.
Sure. Well, one of them would be Dry Fly Distilling. This is an organization, 2 guys, Don and Kent, who started the business. They were both in food services, and they were fly fishing buddies. And, in one of their fly fishing expeditions, sitting around the campfire, they were joking about starting a distillery, and they decided to do that. Now, these guys used a couple types of financing strategies in order to launch their business.
Well, right before we get to the analytical part, I just got to say, how often are people listening right now, if they're listening to this on a Monday morning driving into their office, or they're out on their morning run this week, they probably had one of those conversations this weekend, having beers with a friend, on a camping trip, what we ought to do. It usually starts with what we ought to do is ...
It always starts that way. So what's really interesting is if you look at the data, our customers will tell you that more times than not, the way they found their business is that an opportunity presented itself. They were open to that opportunity when it fell into their lap or came across their desk or came up in a conversation randomly, like I'm talking about with Don and Kent. But the reality is we think about small business ownership and entrepreneurship as this really highly scientific, well-prepared process. And I can tell you, like even with Guidant Financial, we were in the real estate development business. And this idea came up because we were learning through that process how difficult it was to find capital, even in a real estate operating company. And that sort of accidental discovery led us to where we are today. We launched this business with $10,000 in a laptop and have grown it to where it is now.
How many years?
It's been about 14 years.
Yeah.
14 years later, but it is not a scientific process. So these two guys sitting around a campfire decide, hey, we're going to launch a distillery. And they did that. And what's really exciting about these guys, their story is phenomenal. They, at the time that I met with them about 4 years ago, actually went out to their location to see their business. They had one employee. And that was the actual gentleman who was creating the alcohol. I think they call it the distiller. And what they had done is created this unique experience where they were inviting people in to come in on the weekend and learn about distilling vodka, gin, and whiskey. And then for that, they got a t-shirt and were able to work in their facility bottling their product. But what's interesting, they had a 6-month waiting list for free labor to help them put this thing together. It was amazing.
That is incredible. And what I love is one employee is all they had. What does that business look like now?
Well, I can't tell you the details of the business. Yeah. What I can tell you is that they're a very successful organization.
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Yeah, they're the first actually distiller to launch in Washington State since Prohibition. And so they've actually been solely,
they were the beginning of all these different distillers that now have this kind of cachet place not far from here in a place called Woodinville, where people will go through and do tastings. And they were the first ones.
Yeah, they sort of were the grandfather behind this micro distilling climate that is in Washington State now. So that's one example.
And so you started to talk about how they did it, like a little bit of the financing side, because people I'm sure right now they've got their version of Dry Fly in their head. They're driving along. What did they do to get it going? Because that's not an uncapital intensive business. Yeah,
well, so part of the way that they did is they used their retirement assets to invest in the business, as opposed to taking a taxable distribution
with penalties
or paying their penalties and taxes. Right? Mm-hmm. They instead used their capital as for lack of a better term, an angel investment in their own business. And they actually physically invested in the stock of the business, providing capital to it. And then they also used some bank financing to help launch it. So we've seen in small business, many transactions actually use more than one type of financing or funding strategy. And they're an example of that.
And when you do that, catch me if I'm wrong here, but you actually end up with the bank in a better mood because you're taking your money to invest in equity in the business, plus their financing. So to the bank, they feel a little bit better in making sure that you've got some of your money in it versus going into the bank with your pockets turned inside out saying, hey, I don't have anything. I'd like you to give me all your money to take a risk on this great idea that we came up around the campfire.
Yeah, every bank is going to require some skin in the game. The question really is, where do you want that skin to come from? Most people, in fact, it's not uncommon for people to call us and say, man, I wish I knew I could use my retirement funds as investment capital because I took a taxable distribution, paid the early penalties, and then used that as a down payment. Well, at that point, they're looking at about half of what they had originally, right? So in that case, people have a decision to either take a distribution from their plan. That's going to obviously give it a nice haircut. The second is they could use their rainy day savings. And that would be, along the lines of the things that you talk about, Paul, in your podcast around sufficiency versus surplus, right? Yeah. And then the other is that they could actually use that as investment capital. And one of the ways that we do that is by helping them use their IRA or 401k and convert that into capital that they can actually invest in their business.
And in doing that, because one of the things I talk to people about all the time, and I think we're pretty unique. There's other people that do it, but I can't easily find them in the marketplace that talk about the amount of liability chasing you through time, like a shadow that you can't outrun on your retirement plan assets. And that is that the IRS you owe money to with the money that you've got in the plan. And that doesn't become real. Like primarily because every time you get a 401k statement, somebody has $300,000 in their 401k. Every time they get their statement, it says $300,000. It seems like what you would have is $300,000. And I personally feel like what there ought to be is a federal law that allows a disclosure that you have to understand that 40 or 45% of that actually belongs to the IRS today if you were to take it out with taxes and penalties. And so your 300 looks a lot more like 175, or I'm sorry, 225 if you were to just try and distribute it. 300 looks like, I get it right the first time, 175. That's the problem with doing math in my head while we're recording a podcast. So anyway, it's a lot less, probably to the tune of 40 to 45%, depending on the state you live in, because your state's going to take a bite, plus penalties, plus taxes. And what you do that's so unique is you actually gave Dry Fly Distillery and the partners there the ability to actually use the IRS's money to their advantage in a certain way, because they, just like they're a co-investor in the portfolio that we choose, like a little partner in our 401k, they become a little partner in that equity share of the business. Not in a way that's inappropriate, but we didn't have to cash out the IRS before we invested in our own business. Like one of the few ways that becomes a little bit advantageous of having had that retirement plan.
Yeah, let me state it a little bit differently, right? So the one of the biggest challenges that we have is what I call market awareness. People know that they can invest their retirement assets in stocks and bonds and mutual funds, but they don't actually realize that they can use that capital while inside a retirement plan, still in a tax-deferred environment, to invest in even real estate or small businesses or buy a franchise, even loan money, as long as it's not to people that provide a conflict of interest. Okay,
Yeah.
Those are all things that are possible. So technically not the IRS's money, but you're right. There is this long-term expense, for lack of a better term. You know that when you start pulling that money out, whether you're of age or not, there's going to be at least taxes, if not penalties on top of that.
Yeah,
right?
we just have to pay the IRS every time we take a distribution.
For sure. Yeah. And depending on the time period, there may be penalties associated with that. That is absolutely true. But Congress actually explicitly passed laws to incent people to invest in businesses. And so this is something that has been legal for a long period of time, but most people just are not aware that they can do it. So we're spending time educating a certain audience on this capability. The good news is, though, they're investing in businesses, and those businesses are paying taxes, creating jobs for people who are paying taxes. So a lot of people think about this, think, well, you're avoiding paying taxes. Well, the answer is absolutely not.
Not at all. In fact, one day
it's still an investment, right? So one day when you sell that business, proceeds from that sale are going to come back into that plan. And then eventually when you distribute it, you will pay taxes. So we're still respecting the tax deferred nature and the long-term liability that you will have in terms of taxes. In the meantime, though, you're actually contributing to economic growth and creating jobs and activity that will provide tax revenue even in the near term. So
Okay,
it's a win for everybody.
So for those of you that don't like the super analytical stuff, I want to go a little nerdy for a moment. If that's you, you don't need to tune out. This will be over soon. We'll treat it like pulling a Band-Aid off. So what we can do is they own now the plan, that person's 401k. Let's stick with the $300,000 example, that in their work with your team, they're able to invest, which there's work that has to be done. You can go to Guidant's website. You can request a conversation to see if it's appropriate for you. As they do that, though, one day they invest in the stock, and sometime later, say they sell the business. Then that money, whatever it sells for, that's that percentage ownership in the retirement plan, that money gets pushed back to the retirement plan in cash, and they just go invest it somewhere else, like in an investment portfolio or whatever. Is that like close?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What ends up happening is effectively the retirement plan becomes an investor in the stock. So let me just go up a layer and let's talk about, you have a 401k today. You've invested in public stock like, say, Apple, popular holding for people today, right? So I buy Apple shares, and let's say I buy them at $100 a share, and then that goes up to $140. When I sell, the net proceeds of that sale are going back into my retirement plan. I'm not paying taxes on that, right?
Yes.
Now, inside a business, it's a little bit more complicated for private businesses because sometimes on liquidation, there are some taxes that are due. But the net proceeds of that sale are going to go back to the retirement plan. And that is going to be respected in that tax deferred environment for you to then invest again in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, or like some of our clients, another business.
And the key, and what I want everybody listening to understand, is this is not for an amateur. What you don't want to do is go find somebody who says, say they're a third-party administrator, and they says, oh, we can do that. Ask, how many have you done if you were going to investigate this? Because it's not easy. There's rules to follow, and you want somebody that knows how to do it. Now, you guys are like national leaders in this by a long shot, yeah? And so, one, if you're thinking about this, going back to my statement earlier, you need to be careful, you need to understand it, and you got to work with an expert. Let's hear another story. I want to hear a story of another, maybe not campfire, but somebody who went down this path that people would know the name of or could Google, and they'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that was started by a couple of people around a campfire and a 401k or two.
Sure. Well, so great example. Just the other day, I was reading an article in Fortune on one of our customers, Kim Malik from Salt and Straw. And this is a ice cream chain that was started in Portland, Oregon, and now has gone national. In fact, a large restaurant group made an investment, and they're now expanding into New York. So,
wow,
fantastic business. This woman is one hell of an entrepreneur. She was a Starbucks employee, was in, like many of our customers, someone who'd spent a lot of time in corporate America, who had experience and an idea that they wanted to put to work and just needed the right financing, the right opportunity. And she decided to make the leap years ago and has built a phenomenal enterprise that is making a meaningful difference in the communities that they're part of.
And every one of, at least now we've heard a couple of stories with a few different people, all employees at one point, all people that prior to having their idea were diligently building their own balance sheet while working for somebody else. Like, if you're working for somebody else, you had better be building your personal balance sheet while you're helping whoever the owner is, if it's Amazon or if it's Apple or if it's PACCAR or Boeing. You're helping them build their balance sheet every day you go in, or they wouldn't be paying you. You better be building your personal balance sheet while you're along with it. But that's what gives you the freedom, autonomy, or opportunity to go take that good idea and do something with it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, it's not uncommon. I'm sure anyone who's listening to this podcast has had that itch. Like, am I an entrepreneur? Should I consider starting or buying my own business, right? And there are moments in our life that thrust us towards that opportunity. And then there's others, like we discussed a minute ago, where they're a little bit more random.
Yeah.
And I think that openness is certainly important. It's funny though, we finance lots of different businesses. We've talked about two that are independent brands that were built by individuals. But, one part of small business that a lot of people don't hear about because it's not, quote unquote, sexy,
yes,
is franchising.
Yes.
And what's amazing is there's 4,000 types of franchise brands across the country. Nearly every type of business you can think of has a franchise system that's already been developed for people who maybe don't want to start it from scratch, but instead would like the support of a system. It's the mantra that we use is not in business by yourself, but in business for yourself. And so we spend a lot of time working with companies like UPS stores, Anytime Fitness, Menchie's. Another great one would be Express Employment Professionals or Wild Birds Unlimited. There's lots of different sort of niche and vertical businesses that are franchise establishments that can be good opportunities as well.
That somebody they've got a passion for. They've been in corporate where they're working with or for somebody else, and they're like, I want to break out. And if somebody has a couple 300,000 in their 401k, that may be more in reach than what they think, especially considering if you've built your balance sheet elsewhere also, that you've got reach, you've got capacity you may not have known. Can people is there any, I would imagine it's just the same whether it's a franchise or it would be buying an existing business. It's still a franchise thing, but I always think of if you bought the Baskin-Robbins from the older couple that's finally ready to drive their RV full time, It's got a balance sheet. It's got value, it has cash flow. It's a known enterprise. It's the one on the corner downtown. Everybody loves it. Is that like same as buying any of the others?
For sure. In fact, it's about half of our business. So what's fascinating is there's really two types of buyers, right? One who wants to launch, this is whether it's a startup or a franchise, but a new business, right? Somebody who wants to launch it on their own, wants to build their own team, wants to find their own real estate, create their own list of vendors, who really wants control over that process and to launch it. And then there's those who say, you know what, I actually don't want that. I want that predictable cash flow. I want the assets and the inventory and the team already built in, and I want to buy it, based not on opportunity, but more on financials. That's, like I said, about half of our business does that. But in terms of the actual structure that you might use, whether it's an SBA loan, a portfolio loan, unsecured credit, or this 401k strategy, the rollovers for business startups arrangements, it's all the same.
Okay, I want to go to what I think is the elephant in the room, which is if you're a corporate employee, you've been an executive, successful somewhere, you've been making $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year. The idea of going out on your own and what screams in your head are the failure rates of businesses. And these are things that are, you were citing a study just a little bit earlier when you and I were talking prior to the podcast. Talk a little bit about that and what you do specifically as an organization to try to support people to get over that hump and increase success. Because you talked about supporting them, but I think that statistic you shared with me kind of...
Yeah, well, Dun & Bradstreet will tell you that less than 50% of businesses that are started don't exist 5 years later. So that is a really high rate of failure. And we've seen just the opposite, where we're nearly performing at double that rate, meaning that about 80% of our clients are still operating. And that number doesn't include that they've sold the business, because that's not uncommon for people to get in and realize this isn't for me, or build it for 2 or 3 years and say, I want to get out now, right?
Yes.
So that statistic, although 80% is significantly higher, it's likely higher than that. But I think, it's funny, you hear small business is a risky investment. And I think that has to do with your mindset. And I don't want to get woo-woo on the podcast, but the reality is there are those that believe that we should have a little bit more control, autonomy, and even authority in where we go long-term. And then there are those that believe they need to protect them, protect you from yourself, I should say. Yeah. So there seems to be two schools of thought around entrepreneurship, and even at a more granular level, whether you should use your retirement assets to invest in something that you own and control yourself.
And I think what most shows up for me in that, so if you're out there and you are a business owner right now and you've been launching a small business, you're starting to make decent money, or if you're in a corporation, you've thought about starting a small business, you got to go get help. And I don't mean help like Guidant, although Guidant might be one, but get a coach, get somebody that's helping you. People bring us on as a part of that team to help them look at their overall financial picture to make sure that they're ready to make that jump when they want to. But you got to build that team. If you don't build that team, then I think that success ratio is the key, is that the first Dun & Bradstreet number you gave is the one where people are out there on their own, rolling the dice, trying to figure it out. And while Guidant happened, and by the way, in that number are also all the people that got help. All the people that got support, that sought out mentors and coaches and consultants to help them do better. And then you have they're in there too, because the numbers would be far worse if we could somehow extract everybody out of the Dun & Bradstreet's number that had so much hubris and ego that they never surrendered to help.
Yeah, it's interesting. In my book, which you talked about making the jump into small business ownership, I talk about building a team and doing it from the get-go. Because the trap that everyone runs into is, if I have the time and money, then I will go and do this. And the problem is that if you don't do it from the beginning, that time and money trap will always be there. I mean, I've been doing this for 14 years. I have a coach. We have attorneys inside the company. We also have attorneys outside the company that we use as experts to help us continue to build the business. And so regardless of the scale, you still need to build that support team. And, if you're thinking about buying a business or starting a business, or maybe utilizing a franchise business model, there are franchise brokers and coaches. There are CPAs and attorneys. There's a business broker if you want to look at, buying an existing business. There's lots of professionals out there to help you get into business. And then there are financing companies like ours who, help people put the capital together. And then there's just a million services that you could potentially use. The questions that I would have are, which are the most important and add the greatest value so that I can focus on building my business and not worry about really the operational aspects that take so much time and keep us from growing our businesses long term.
I was going to say, I want to get a few of those key things, but before we do that, I want to go back to one of our past podcasts when Charlotte Whitmore was on, and she hired an actual CEO to run her company so that her and her husband could do the things they most like to do inside their business. And when she did that, she said what gave her the idea that she needed to do something different was when she was Googling how to solve certain business problems for this incredibly successful data analytics company that they own. And she, in the middle of her Googling, said, I don't think I should be Googling this decision. And that's what led her to say, oh my gosh. So if you want to find that one, I don't have the podcast episode off the top of my head, but we'll get it in the show notes for you. You don't want to go, what attorney should I use? Like the day after you sign the lease on the business, but it happens all the time. Oh, I need to get I've heard this one repeatedly. I need to get a CPA because I've never owned a business before. But we do it all the time because lots of times the personality that's willing to take the risk is the same personality that is willing to, for lack of a better word, be willing to stitch their parachute on their way down to catch them. But it's problematic when you're taking a risk, you don't have to. Because anybody listening now, if you're thinking about starting a small business, the types of professionals that David's going to talk about here in a moment, whoever these key people are, which I'm interested to hear, you can start taking these people to lunch right now. In your current role, whatever you're doing, just they love being able to talk to somebody. I even think of for myself, if somebody said, hey, I'm thinking about going into business, could I just buy you a cup of coffee and we could talk about it after church? I would do that in a minute. And most entrepreneurs would. And most of the professionals in these domains, if you say, I have no idea if business ownership's right for me, but I'd like to talk to you and better understand what you do and the way you serve business owners and people trying to find businesses to see whether or not I should do that. Who are those key people that folks should be looking for?
Yeah, great. A couple things I want to say. I want to go back to the comments you made about replacing yourself as a CEO. And
yes.
I'm not going to debate the philosophy there. I think instead I would just say, one of our values internally is excellence. And we define that as getting better every day. And that's because we know that we'll never always have the answers, but we need to continue to move towards, we think of it in terms of continuous improvement. Mm-hmm. One thing I will say though, is that I think one of the greatest skill sets that an entrepreneur can have, a business owner should have, is self-awareness. Know what you don't know. Right. So that's getting to the point that you're talking about. And that is surround yourself with people who can help you problem solve, troubleshoot, or think through some of the challenges that are come your way every single day that you're not yet equipped to handle. Okay. So the people in terms of early stages of starting or buying a business, I think you are dead on in that they want to have coffee. They want you to reach out to them because the industry is so fragmented. It's impossible for a CPA or a franchisor or a business broker or any of these small business professionals to do a lot of targeted marketing because it's too expensive to find you as a potential entrepreneur.
Yes.
So you reaching out to them and saying, hey, I'm thinking about this. Would you be willing to develop a relationship with me over a period of time? Man, I'll tell you what, they would jump at the opportunity. And if you're thinking about that, feel free to give us a call. We provide introductions to people all over the country every single day because we know that we can't help you until you've gotten down that path anyway. So if we can help put you in touch with credible experts, people that really know and understand these industries and opportunities, we're more than happy to do that. But the people that come to mind for me, certainly a CPA. I think when you're looking to transact, it'd be helpful to have someone who really understands business and business modeling from a financial perspective. Then there's the attorney, someone who can help you in terms of mitigating risk going in. And then finally, depending on the type of transaction, a business broker or a franchise coach an independent consultant who can help you look at these small business opportunities, whether they're franchise or non-franchise establishments, and help you understand the opportunity therein.
Now, to something that I think people get themselves in what I might call a cognitive thermostat, like what they think is possible for them or not. I think the easiest one people relate to is like their own personal weight. Like I remember for years, I weighed over 200 pounds and I just thought that's how it was, that I was just built that way. Growing up in a household, they say you're big bone. That's just how you are. I think people the same, which I don't weigh that much now, just for the record, but I did for a long, long time. For people that are listening, they may be 35, 45, 55. And some time ago, they said, I'm not an entrepreneur. That is not me. Tell us about the ages of the people that you guys engage and help make that jump into small business.
Yeah, it's all over the board. I mean, from my perspective, an entrepreneur is someone who wants to challenge the status quo, do something different, have more control over the outcomes in my life. So we've served people who are in their 20s all the way up to their 70s. So it really, to me, doesn't, based on race or age or education or income, those don't necessarily make you an entrepreneur or not. One thing I will say, though, is based on how you are wired, because we're all wired a little bit differently, might lead you down the path of saying, hey, I want to start my own entrepreneurial enterprise. Like I want it to be mine, my brand, my process, my system. Another might say, well, I want to go through the process of launching a business, but I don't want all the risks or headaches of creating that business from scratch. So maybe a new franchise would be for me. And then there's this whole other category of people who say, you know what? I don't want either of those headaches. I just want to buy something that's already up and running. It's proven, it's established, and I just want to optimize that.
Yeah, do it better than it was being done before. Because maybe somebody's owned it for the last 8 years. They've been semi-retired anyway. But man, if I went in there and just went to work for 5 years, I'd have an incredible amount of freedom for the next 20.
Yeah, you see this all the time. You see these guys or gals that have been running these businesses. They're doing very well. They provide a nice cash flow, nice lifestyle. But someone coming in who's going to hustle like they're broke could really build something tremendous. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I think talking to a coach up front, a broker, a franchise coach makes sense, because a lot of times what they'll do is actually spend some time assessing your personality, your needs, your experience, and then trying to help match that to a business format that could be right for you.
So the way somebody can get a hold of you and your organization is Guidant Financial, which just as a by the way, they also have a lighthouse as their logo. And there is no relation. We have joked over drinks in the past about one of us is going to have to eventually break and no longer have a lighthouse. They're slightly different lighthouses, but if you look at Sound Financial Group and you look at Guidant, they're both lighthouses. That's just virtue of being in the Pacific Northwest. So to get a hold of David and his team, you can go to guidantfinancial.com. And once again, a reminder that we have this special landing page just for our audience for you to be able to get David's book, enormously generous gift from David and his organization to give away the e-version of his book. All you have to do is go to jump.sfgwa.com, put in your email address, and we will drop his book right in your email box. One small story that I want to share, because I think that this is key for those of you that are out there listening who may have been working with what I'll just say generally as the typical financial advisor. Which you might be able to oftentimes boil down to them being an investment manager. And in a conversation 2 days ago with a client that has several $1 million, exploring to buy a business right now, he's positioned most of his money actually outside of retirement plans. And so he has the ability to do it. He also has enough money in building his personal balance sheet that he doesn't have to. And we began to talk about how he needs to position himself. And he went through our design process, he and his wife, earlier this year. And he said, we're looking at our money and everything's so much different. We're on the same page in a way we haven't been before. And you know what it came down to is he'd only been working with, and by the way, like a big national company with all kinds of prestige company, but they're investment managers. And they've been managing his investments quite well, but he hasn't worked with somebody helping him manage his overall balance sheet. And so when we started to talk about what it took for him to buy a business, nobody, even though he's told these investment managers that's his intent, all they did is continue to review his returns every year instead of saying, one, we should take some cash off the table and carve it aside. So if the market goes down, it's going to make it easier to buy a business, but you're not going to lock in losses, which is something we talked about. He hadn't been looking at the most appropriate tax structures to put it in. And certainly nobody told him anything about an organization like Guidant that might have allowed him to move differently inside his retirement plans for the last 20 years in corporate to be able to have that be part of the funding mechanism for him to make the jump into small business ownership. So for all of you out there, these podcasts, our philosophy, my book, all of it's out there to do two things. One, for the right people, you're going to be attracted. You may want to reach out to us. You can email us at info@sfgwa.com. That's Sound Financial Group, Whiskey Alpha, WA.com. And what we try to do is support you in having the outcomes that you want. It's not about just investment management. It's about what does it take to do with your balance sheet to get where you want to go. Guidant is a company whose aim is to make sure that when appropriate, to the best of their ability, they're able to help you fund that future that you want, that additional autonomy that you might want and freedom that you might want of being a business owner. Or the one last thing occurred to me for our business owners that are listening that I'd love you to comment on. Somebody already owns a business. They've had the Baskin Robbins. And they're saying to themselves, I want to buy another one. I want to expand. Or they've been a business owner that's been small and they've been putting money in a retirement plan. Is there help there? Or is it like done once you've started a business, you can't do it?
The answer is yes. You definitely can invest your retirement assets into an existing business. The process is slightly different. There's a few extra steps in that, but the answer is yes. But one of the main ways that we see our customers who are looking to expand into their next location, because this is very common in franchising where I would own, one Subway franchise and now I'm going to open my second and my third or more.
And I didn't know about an option like this when I did the first one. So I've had money locked up in a retirement plan.
Right. Well, and so you can use retirement assets, but what we're seeing more often than not are people actually starting to use bank debt in those cases because they have a proven business model that can support the debt. And they can use that to lever out much further than just one or two locations. So, as the businesses launch, startups is where there is a significant challenge in small business financing. And so this fills a necessary void to keep that sort of economic engine going. Once the business is up and running and they've got a proven history, not only as a business, but as an entrepreneur, then they become much more bankable over time.
And you guys, I don't want you to get lost when you're hearing this. Guidant does both, and you'll see this when you go to guidantfinancial.com, GUIDANT financial.com, is that they handle both ends of that, both the ability to use some of your own capital to invest in your business and the banking and financing side so that those two marry together in what I would say is almost like a macroeconomic way instead of trying to find somebody to do a one-off on the lending side and a one-off on the other side. So, David, thank you so much for being here today. I am thankful both for your friendship and watching you in business over time, watching you in leadership with the Entrepreneurs Organization here in Seattle, and the gift that you gave to our listeners and being able to give away your book is just phenomenal. In parting words, what's the last thing you would tell somebody? They're thinking, a lot of pressure here. They're thinking, I might want to get out of corporate. What is the one thing that they need to, a question they need to ask themselves or something they need to tell themselves before they consider that as a real viable option before they make the jump into small business ownership?
Well, because I'm an entrepreneur, I'm going to change this slightly, and I'm going to answer it in two different ways.
That would only be normal.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, and this might sound a little bit self-serving, but the reality is the book that I wrote because there's a lot of books out there to teach you to be a good manager who will help you in terms of building culture, lots of great books on technical ways to build your business once you've launched. But there really aren't any books there that help you think through the process of building or buying or starting a business and really focus on that question, am I an entrepreneur? Do I want to put myself through that? So I would recommend, we're giving it away for free. Yep. Read the book.
It's great.
The second is, if the answer is yes, or if you think that is a high likelihood that you would want to move down that path now or sometime in the future, on our website is a pre-qualification tool. It's very simple, based on user-generated content. So you would put in your own information, takes about 2 minutes, and it will actually return a result that tells you how much you could finance up to. Because in small business finance, unlike mortgage, where it's a very standard, real estate, it's a very standard process to talk to your mortgage professional before you start shopping for real estate. That doesn't exist in small business. So if you are curious about whether you're bankable or fundable or not, that might be a great way to start to add some confidence in the process early on.
Great. And I knew it would be just like you to end up bringing more value than we originally intended from the podcast. So thank you again. Once again, in the show notes, we're going to have a link to that tool that David just talked about. We're going to have a link for you to be able to go in and get a free copy of David's book, Making the Jump into Small Business Ownership. And should any of you feel like, man, something about this is resonating with us, then me or one of my advisors would be happy to chat with you. Anybody who's a listener to our podcast, we gladly give a 10-minute conversation to. And we'd love to support you. We're glad to have you on the podcast today. And we look forward to having you back on our podcast, listening, engaging every week. So be sure to subscribe, give us a review, check us out on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook. And if there's something you want covered in our podcast, then just send it in. Send it in an email, and we'd be happy to get to it. We've had people send us charts and graphs and different things that we've been able to bring in and adopt, and we'd love you to contribute both your thinking and your questions to our podcast, and we will definitely give you a shout out. Enjoy the rest of your week, and remember, all of this is meant to contribute to you to be able to design and build a good life.
I want to acknowledge you for taking the time to tune in to Sound Financial Bites. You stopped long enough in your busy day to reflect on your finances and your future to help you design and build a good life. Please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast and follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook and LinkedIn. If you have a topic you would like to hear us discuss, please send us a note on Facebook, LinkedIn, soundfinancialbites.com, or email us at info@sfgwa.com. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to any resources that were covered in each episode. For our full disclosure, please check the description of this episode, the description of this podcast series, or you can visit our website. Make it a great day.